I don't know, about an hour into it, Warren Mosler comes on and he does this great talk about turning his business cards into money. And I thought, there are people out there, when they talk, you realize this person wants me to understand something. Because there are some people out there who are like, yeah, maybe they want you to understand something, but it seems more of a priority that they let you know that they're really clever. And they shroud a lot of what they're saying in words that sound really, endogenous, exogenous. And you're like, oh, well, this person's really clever. And there are other words we could use.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. For as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. A big thank you to all our supporters so far. So this episode is an interview me and Patricia gave to Thomas Hornigold, who is the host of the Physical Attraction Podcast, which is about physics, get your minds out of the gutter. But as his coverage of science has expanded into a discussion of climate science and sustainability, it looks to me like the distribution of resources has become an unavoidable topic, which means discussing economics, which means discussing politics. I know that some people feel that economic schools of thought and their proponents should be apolitical, but it seems to me that the way we distribute things is a consequence of policies, so whether we like it or not, that's going to involve politics. To quote economist Ha-Joon Chang, quote, "There is no such thing as a free market. The free market doesn't exist. Every market has some rules and boundaries that restrict freedom of choice. A market looks free only because we so unconditionally accept its underlying restrictions that we fail to see them. How free a market is cannot be objectively defined. It is a political definition. The usual claim by some economists that they are trying to defend the market from politically motivated interference by the government is false. Government is always involved, and those economists are as politically motivated as anyone. Overcoming the myth that there is such a thing as an objectively defined free market is the first step towards understanding capitalism." End quote. Just as a footnote, in that quote, I substituted the words "some economists" for free market economists, because I think once we've established that markets can never be objectively described as free, it follows that there can't be such a thing as a free market economist. And I think it might help that fact sink in if we stop automatically attaching the word free to the word market in most contexts. So, 1 and 1 equals 2 is maybe not political, but 2 of what, and who gets the 2, and who gets 0, and what the consequences of that are is political. And separating the consequences from the maths and calling it objectivity, in my experience, tends to be a position favoured by the person who gets the 2. Funny how that works. So, huge thanks to Thomas for his interest in MMT and introducing it to his audience. This is part 1 of a 2-part conversation. We hope this conversation would make a decent intro to MMT. Just before we dive in the show notes, I've linked to where you can find and support Thomas's Physical Attraction Podcast. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast via patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Your support really helps keep the show going. It keeps the lights on, it puts food on the table, and we really appreciate it. Support starts at $1 a month, which is 77 British pence at the time of recording. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. As ever, thanks for taking the time to understand and spread the word about MMT. Let's dive in.
First of all, I'd like to thank you both very much for coming on the show.
Our pleasure.
Thank you. Yeah, pleasure.
So, modern monetary theory, or MMT, is essentially a new way of looking at economics. Its advocates, which include you guys, who host the MMT podcast, which explains this and interviews lots of the key leading figures in it, insist that it's really just a correct description of what's going on in the real economy. but it does make a number of claims about how the economy works that a lot of people consider to be counterintuitive. And so I think it's going to be a good springboard for us to start talking about what's different between MMT and mainstream economics and how it differs from people's general understanding. And I think a lot of people are going to say, well, this is quite abstract where we're talking about different theories of economics and which one is valid and so on. But Keynes, the famous economist, has a quote that I think is very relevant to this, which is, he said something along the lines of, the ideas of economists and political theorists, whether they are right or wrong, are more powerful than is commonly believed. Indeed, the world is run by little else. So we could be talking about some potentially pretty world-changing stuff here, and I'm sure you guys would agree with that. And I think everyone should come at this with a bit of an open mind. Maybe you don't agree with everything that MMT says about the economy. As someone who's not a professional economist myself, I'm not sure I know enough to say that it's a perfect description. But unless you think that our status quo descriptions of economics, which aren't always that successful at making predictions and so on, are perfect, I think it's worth listening to ideas from outside the status quo and seeing what you think. But before we get into some more details about MMT, I'd like to ask for a little bit of backstory so the audience can get to know you both a bit better. So you guys host the MMT podcast, which has been a really great resource for me to get my head around all of this. And over the course of doing that, you've interviewed many of the key economists behind MMT to get them to explain it in their own words. So I want to ask you both, how did you first hear about MMT and come to be converted, because it is often sort of expressed like a conversion, to this new way of thinking about economics?
Just, like a lot of people, I became interested in economics after the 2008 crash. And I think a lot of people had a lot of questions. And if you remember back then, it was after the crash, it was all about the budget, and it was the beginning of the long period of kind of extreme austerity that we've had. So this idea that the priority was to balance the books was heavily debated in politics, but it wasn't, nobody really explained it in a way that made sense to me. And it seemed like they seemed to repeat the same slogans. We need to balance the budget, but nobody would explain why, or the debt is too high. Well, what is too high debt? I mean, how do we know that? And it seemed to me obvious, maybe because I'm an engineer, I approach things in a very kind of practical way, that if we're going to cut spending, then sure, if we're going to cut services which are important to people to people with low incomes, then we better make sure that the debt is too high. We're not cutting things unnecessarily. And that kind of led me into a path of curiosity with economics. And I first approached friends of mine who had studied economics. They didn't have the answers that I needed. Then I started investigating other routes, and I found that the mainstream narrative of economics didn't really make sense in my head as a whole. It seemed to me there were too many holes in the narrative, and so that's how I remembered that a friend of mine had mentioned Bill Mitchell's blog, and I had at the time dismissed it because that is a natural reaction, I guess, to the notion that taxes don't fund government spending. But then I thought, well, I've kind of hit a wall here. Let's try and see whether this guy actually has something to tell me that might solve my problem. So I gave the blog a second look, and I don't recommend it as a first kind of text for anybody, because it's very heavily laden with kind of complex terminology, like proper academic economics terminology. But I powered through it, and I forced myself to read it in detail. And these concepts just it took me a while to absorb them, and I think we have this. It's funny because it kind of the whole thing made sense on one evening when I was at home, and it's like the penny dropped, and suddenly I felt like, I have to tell this to everybody. This makes so much sense, and it made sense in a way that the mainstream narrative didn't make sense. And then you start building upon that idea, and you start realizing that everything that you've been told is pretty much a lie. And as you say, and I completely kind of relate to that Keynes idea of that economists have more power, they're more powerful than commonly believed. These ideas, this belief underpins everything else that works on it. So I'm an engineer for a profession, and I can see how my fellow engineers have really strong interest in helping people and solving world problems, but they all work within this framework of, government budgets have to be balanced, and it really limits them, and it limits them in a way that they don't even realize it, and they don't have the knowledge or the understanding to challenge those things. So I really felt when I came across these ideas that this was important. It felt like this was something that I needed to shout it from the rooftops and tell everybody.
Yeah, my story is similar. Yeah, I was wondering what was going on in 2008 when they were telling us there's no money, and but also there was loads of money at the same time. I was like, what is this Schrodinger's pound? Just depending on who looks at it. It exists or it doesn't. I started reading the Naked Capitalism blog because that's got a lot of heterodox economists writing on it. And then I came across a talk by, first of all, I came across a talk by Michael Hudson. I found a really good conference that they had in 2010 called the Fiscal Responsibility Conference. And at this conference, it was kind of a counter conference to I think the Pete Peterson Foundation was hosting a conference across town. This is in Washington, I think, about what we've got to fix the debt, i.e. we've got to wipe it out, pay it down. And there are obviously all these, as we now know them, post-Keynesian economists who were like, no, you don't want to do that. And post-Keynesian means they're following the work of Keynes. Keynes himself would be a post-Keynesian. And on this conference, there was Bill Mitchell, Stephanie Kelton, Warren Mosler, Marshall Auerbach, and Pavlina Chernova, and Randy Wray on this panel. And maybe, I don't know how many people were in attendance, probably below 100 people. Just they're just an excellent lineup. And they go through MMT and what would a fiscally responsible situation look like, and about an hour into it, Warren Mosler comes on and he does this great talk about turning his business cards into money, which I go on and on about on the podcast. It's like my favorite MMT thing. And I thought, there are people out there, when they talk, you realize this person wants me to understand something. Because there are some people out there who are like, yeah, maybe they want you to understand something, but it seems more of a priority that they let you know that they're really clever. And they shroud a lot of what they're saying in words that sound really, endogenous, exogenous. You're like, oh, well, this person's really clever, and there are other words we could use, So
physics has this problem too.
Saying, oh, is it right? Okay, so I started trying to decipher all this stuff. The rest of it, when you understand that the government's a currency issuer, how can it be any other way? You kind of go, oh, right, okay. And then you have to just work through everything you think you know about everything.
I think it's interesting you mentioned Naked Capitalism, Eve Smith, I think. And I was just reading her book, Econned. And the interesting thing at the start of that book is that you do realize how accurate this Keynes quote is about the ideas of economists and political theorists being so important, because you can see how much of the last 30, 40 years has been sort of dominated by a lot of neoclassical ideas of economics about free markets being very efficient and that's how we should do things, and people being rational actors, this sort of homo economicus idea where everyone is running around maximizing their own self-interest and the government only gets in the way. And these are sort of ideas that people have internalized without even realizing it, I think, in some cases, and that certainly influence a lot of how governments have behaved really since Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher sort of created that axis of this sort of thing in the 80s. And I think it's just interesting that we see whenever there's a crisis, you have economists showing up with new ideas. Keynes himself comes out of the Great Depression and the post-war and all this sort of thing, and how we're going to deal with these issues. And we're in another crisis at the moment, and it seems like a moment when new ideas and new economic theories could be really valuable to just shared a different perspective from what we have at the moment, which is not necessarily working to solve the problems that we're facing as a society. So, you guys, you're communicators of this theory, and I think we want to sort of explain the 101 of it. So there's a couple of ways to get people intrigued by it initially. And one of the main routes in that I've heard you guys discuss before is to ask the question, where does money come from? Would you like to talk about why this question of where money comes from can shed insight onto how MMT works and is different from classical economics?
MMT is different to all the other schools in that Bill Mitchell, Randall Wray, and Martin Watts put out a textbook called Macroeconomics. It's just called Macroeconomics. And apparently the subtitle was going to be Macroeconomics, a government-centered approach, i.e., the MMT money story starts with the government, and none of the other, like you were just saying, certainly since the 80s, they've been thinking about money in it just is. Money's just there. It evolved out of barter. And the government is now trying to get in on that act and get a piece of your money that you've created as the private sector. And that's how they get to spend money. And if you guys out there in the private sector don't do things that make value and turn it into money, then they don't have any money, any tokens to spend. And
so wealth is created by the private sector and then sort of taxed out a bit by the government, and the government's stealing wealth generated from the private sector. And MMT obviously takes a very different view to how all of this stuff works.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you want to take it from there, Patricia?
I think the difference is that, so MMT, I feel that it kind of takes the opposite approach as neoclassical or like the mainstream economics would take, in the sense that they seem to have simply devised this theory about perfect markets and all this stuff that they kind of would like to be true from an ideological perspective, and then simply said, well, how do you explain money? Well, it's just kind of put in there a hypothetical story that would fit with our ideology without actually taking too much interest to check the historical basis for that belief. And so they think that money just sparked out of markets kind of by spontaneous combustion. And
so people were trying to trade the goods and services that they had in a sort
from barter.
I don't know, in an ancient society where you have one person who makes the bread and one person who does the farming and all this sort of thing. People realized that they couldn't come up with decent exchange rates for all of the possible goods and services. And so they came up with money. That's the neoclassical picture.
Yeah, that it was impractical to be carrying around goods to barter, but they just created this thing to make it easy to exchange.
And the MMT picture instead says, okay, well, money comes from the state. Money is invented by the state. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, first of all, we should back up and talk about David Graeber, the late David Graeber, wrote a book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. And there's a key chapter in there, I think it's chapter 3, called The Myth of Barter. And I think that's a good way in for some people, because really...
I have it on my bed. It's chapter 2.
Is it? Right, great. Yeah. So it's really early on in the book, because it's a good debunking of this idea that money evolved from barter. Because really at the bottom of it, it's like, how would that happen? People continuing to just raise pigs, just do that one thing. And not make clay pots or anything like that, and then people on the other side of town that don't know you or just making clay pots, hoping that they can trade them for a pig, and and of course the person with the pigs doesn't want them in the color that you've made, so now you're sitting around starving. He's sitting around with nothing to cook his pigs in, and and you're both starving, and how would this even happen? David Graeber pulls out these quotes from current economics textbooks. This is before Mitchell and Ray and Watts wrote their textbook. And they've all got passages in like, imagine you've got bread, but you want roses. Imagine you've got, and wouldn't that be an awful world? And he goes through a list of them, and it's all imagine. And he's going, yeah, you have to imagine it, because I'm telling you as an anthropologist, and I'm not actually the first, that's not how it happens. There's no evidence for that this happened. And the chapter before The Myth of Barter, and the kind of the rest of the book talks about, people, that didn't have money in their arrangements, societies, tribes, things like that, did do things that looked like barter. They would swap things, but they were ceremonial, and it's not what money evolved out of. And Randall Wray, who's, one of the primary MMT scholars, says, he's gone deep into the history of money, and he's gone like the earliest writing is people keeping track of who owes what to who. Like the very first writing we can discover, and his little joke is writing wasn't invented by poets, it was invented by accountants. And so he's saying, ledgers came first, which is more like what we've got now, modern money. It's not, not a lot of it is on an electronic ledger, and very small amounts of it compared to the rest of the money supply is where people have gone, actually, I'd like to carry a bit of my bank balance around with me in my wallet. So they break off a piece of what they've got stored on that electronic ledger and take some cash out of a hole in the wall, and that's part of your bank statement. So you've got this government-centered approach, and I'll just quickly say this one because I think it's got a lot of explanatory power. What Warren Mosler does when he explains money, he goes, he takes his business cards out of his wallet, and he goes, I've got a business card. It's one of my business cards. He goes, would anybody like to stay after and clean the floor? I'll pay one of these per hour. And then he goes, look, there's no takers. Or I'll pay 2 per hour. No takers. 10 per hour. No takers. And he goes, okay, I'm going to add one more thing. There's only one door out of here, and there's a man at the door with a 9mm machine gun, and he works for me. And you can't get out of the room without paying him one of these business cards. Now he wants to work for me. And of course, everybody needs to work now. And he goes, the guy at the door is the tax man. And the tax man turns litter into money. And that whole idea is called chartalism. And if you go back to, I would believe the first economics book is really Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And there is a line in there about a prince who should enact that a certain portion of taxes paid to him should be paid in a certain type of paper money, can give value to that paper money. So right there in that first, that's a vague paraphrase, but right there in the first economics book, this thing that's known as chartalism, this idea that taxes drive a need for currency, and that allows the authority that issued it to spend it, goes right back. Keynes himself joked, for the last 4,000 years at least, we've had modern money. Early authorities right up to the nation state, these authorities have been deciding what is and isn't money, because money's a creature of law, really, and now in our time and place, it's a creature of nation states. So I hope that made sense.
So just to sort of put across these two competing ideologies right next to each other so that we can see what they look like. The classical one, which we think is wrong now, is this idea that people invented money as a system for exchanging goods amongst themselves and bartering these goods, and they decided that they needed a token of exchange, which was money. And then governments came along later and started taxing people in money, and they took the money from the private sector and they started spending it themselves on whatever they wanted. For example, maintaining a standing army. And the example that we would have is you say, okay, well, imagine instead you are Roman emperor, for example, is a good example of this sort of thing, because they minted coins with their own face on all the time. And you run the state. You could ask for taxes in the form of what people are producing, but instead you invent a token, which is the coin, which is the money system that you're printing centrally as a government, as a Roman emperor. And you insist that tax liabilities, the taxes that people have to pay, must come in the form of the currency that you yourself are printing. And that is what gives the currency value. So it flows out from the government into the rest of society. For example, when the Roman emperor is paying his troops in coins, which they can then go and spend, and it's given value by the necessity for everyone to pay their taxes in that currency. And so one of the interesting consequences of this idea is that once you have this, then in a sense, the taxes that we pay don't exist to fund government spending. but instead they sort of exist to give the money value. Do you want to sort of elaborate on that and the consequences of it?
I think that, if you compare those two stories, you have in the first one the idea that government kind of came in and ruined it for everybody when the market was free and nothing, everybody was happy.
You can see the ideology showing in the history.
And then in the second one, you have, the notion, something that actually economists say now, that there is no such a thing as free market, that the free market relies on, first of all, the enforcement of contracts law. And also, in our case, what we're saying is that the government is the one that says how much the currency is worth. So, depending on what the government is taxing and then what it sets, what is willing to pay for labor, the government is the monopoly issuer of the currency, and therefore it gets to dictate how much currency you get when you work per hour. So by stating that, it can then mobilize the resources that it needs, and by increasing or decreasing taxes, it adjusts the value of the currency in that sense.
We know this is how it works now, so we don't even have to have that argument. That we know that when the government spends, it tells the Bank of England to credit bank accounts of the recipients of the spending, and they type it in, and that's where it comes from. A keystroke at a central bank.
And the coronavirus should have really shown this to everyone, right? Because we've seen the government immediately just print billions upon billions of dollars. It hasn't had to collect taxes in from people beforehand to spend that money.
As well, they can't plan the spending by number of pounds because they don't know how many people are going to tap into their pension tomorrow. Precisely. They don't know how many people are going to claim, all kinds of payments from the government. So, they actually don't know what they're going to spend tomorrow. A lot of these things are automatic. They don't know who's going to go on the dole and things like that. So, the spending just happens. Because the currency is issued by a monopolist, taxes drive currency in that you need to get these tokens, we'll call them pounds here in the UK, in order to pay your taxes. So that gives them value. It gives you a need to get them, but doesn't actually say what that value is going to be of the money out in the marketplace. So what Warren Mosley says is the price level is a function of prices paid by government when it buys something or collateral it demands when it lends. So I'm going to try and put it as simply as I can. If the government is employing a data entry clerk at I don't know, £20 an hour or something like that, then, it would be hard for the market to offer lower than that because, that's what the government's paying for it. And it buys a box of pencils and it buys all these things. And this matrix of prices paid, every time it fixes on a price like that, it is communicating something about the value of its currency. So again, Warren will say, if he tells this little anecdote about he was in Italy giving a tour with his wife, and the tour guide took him around some of the old ruins in Pompeii, and there was a group of people, and the tour guide pulls out a coin and he goes, "Look, we found these coins in the street, as we dug through the lava or whatever it was that, encased Pompeii. And we found these coins in the street, and, basically the government would tax people, take their coins and then spend them, and employ people to be police and people to keep pay the sanitation workers and build the aqueduct. And that's why Pompeii was a really nice place to live, because the government took taxes off people and spent it on public goods." And Warren goes, "I'm a bit of a troublemaker. I said, actually, that's not how it worked." so he goes, "The government spent the money first and then collected taxes." And the tour guide's going, "Well, that's not right, is it?" And he goes, "Well, look at the coin. Where did it come from?" And he goes, "Well, the government made it." It's like, yeah, okay. So how would anybody ever get this money to spend. All right, okay, so they spent the money first and then took them in, and he goes, yeah, that's how else can it work? And apparently they had a bit of a ding dong, and the guy wouldn't listen to him for the rest of the trip. The idea is that the government are going, they levy a tax on people and go, look, you've got to pay, you've got to pay 2 of these every week, 2 of these back to the authority.
Well, and then the government has to say what they need to do to get the coins.
Yes, they're setting the prices by exchanging them for the goods and services that are requisitioned by the government.
So, the government's going to want to have, like, say, police, right? Straight away, it's going to want security. So they go, okay, we'll pay 2 of these for a day's soldiering. Okay, so now that's what it's worth. And somebody else might go, I don't want to be in the army. I want to raise chickens. So I'm going to see how much I can charge for chickens and sell it to a soldier who's actually earning the coins that I need to pay the tax. And, that's how the whole market system develops. That's how the whole private sector develops, all this stuff that the government's not paying for.
So, for example, in Latin America, we had the Incan Empire, and they had a system of taxation which was actually about time of labor. So people were made to work for the government 1 month out of every year, growing food for the government to store in their big storage houses, and the rest of the time they were free to work for themselves, to feed their families, etc. But 1 month a year, what they produce had to go to government, and they kept track of this in a system of knots. But what if instead the government had simply said, everybody owes me a coin, this arbitrary thing, and you have to pay me 1 of these every year. And again, I'm going to pay you 1 of these for 1 month worth of product if you work 1 month for this storage houses. So, they're imposing a need to pay a tax, and then they're saying how much the coin is worth, a month worth of work. So that's kind of the way that the government would then set the prices indirectly for the rest, on which the rest of the market prices would be based upon. If people have to work 1 month for the government in order to obtain that coin, then they would measure all of the prices within the marketplace against that arbitrary level set by government.
Yeah, the government only needs to set one price, and everything else is going to adjust around it.
So we have this alternative picture of where money came from historically and where it comes from today, from the government, spent into existence by the government in MMT. And I think the consequences of this is what I really want to talk about now. So I think one of the ideas that people, mainstream economists, and particularly anyone who's of the sort of Austrian school, I guess you'd say, would find so offensive, is this idea that the government doesn't have to worry about balancing its budget. The government deficit and debt is not necessarily something that we have to be concerned about. And I think even here in the UK, there was a frightening headline that came out the other day about the debt crossing £2 trillion for the first time. We have the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, saying that we'll need to make difficult decisions in the future to pay for the coronavirus crisis, which we're saying at the moment, which sounds a lot like more austerity after the 10 years of austerity that followed the global financial crisis in 2009. I have a lot of listeners in the US as well, and you guys there will know that there's constantly an argument over the deficit ceiling and the debt ceiling, and whichever party it's convenient for seems to be happy to expand the government debt, while the other one plays this role of being fiscally responsible and not wanting to expand the government debt whenever it suits Democrats or Republicans to take on either of those roles. And this is based on this sort of false idea that the government has finances like a household and that its wages are like taxes and that it has to sort of pull in these taxes to provision itself. And of course that borrowing money for the government is sort of bad and unsustainable. And I think this has been a driving force in our politics for, at least since the global financial crisis and even before. So when you have all of this, the idea that it might be wrong is obviously upsetting to a lot of people. So if you'd like to talk about kind of the first thing I think that might even be most important to talk about is obviously the sort of household analogy of finances being wrong, but also just what government debt actually is. Because when you hear about government debt, people constantly think about, well, who do we owe this money to? And people might vaguely think, well, do we owe it all to China, or do we owe it all to, some other country? And when does it have to be paid by, on what terms, and all this sort of thing is not entirely clear to people. And I think it links into this other concept of monetary sovereignty, which we also need to discuss. So I realise that's quite an unwieldy question, but we'd like to talk about government debts and deficits and where they fit into this picture of MMT.
There's a lot to unpack there. But I think I'd like to just maybe talk a little bit about the household analogy, because it's something that I feel like we've been battling with that from the beginning. And it's really frustrating, because I don't think any economist believes in it or speaks in these terms. It's only reserved for politicians. And I think that economists let politicians use that analogy, partly because some of them think it's just instrumental for people to just believe that. And once people believe that, then they stop asking questions. So if the government says there is no money for the NHS, it's easier than to say, we don't believe in the NHS and we'd like to defund it. So it's easier to justify those difficult decisions that Rishi Sunak says he has to make, even though they are completely in line with his ideology, rather than explain to the public the ideological basis for those decisions. And so some economists let politicians explain it in those terms and simplify it to the point where it becomes a lie. And other economists, I think, to be honest, I think they don't really trust the public with the information, or they don't believe that the public is able to understand anything more in depth than that. There is this fear, even amongst what you might consider progressive economists or lefty economists, that if you let the people know that money is no issue, then how are you going to get politicians to be disciplined? Right? Why wouldn't they just spend on everything and cause inflation and destroy everything? And they think this keeps the bad politicians in line as well. That they fear that they might just give tons of money to the rich, and because there's nothing to worry about in the budget, then nobody would say anything, because what's there to worry about? And I think that's a very, first of all, condescending way of talking to the electorate. I don't think that helps the electorate to make the right decisions at all. And it actually makes people vote against their own interests most of the time, as we have seen in 2010 and in the last election. But the other thing is that, they also don't have an inherent mistrust for democracy. And I have this feeling that they have this idea that the least people know, the better. And I really resent that. And I think that's something that we have to clear up.
Yeah. So, it becomes a question of how do we break through this household analogy? Because it's really powerful. And, I have a pet theory that it's just because our experience with money is we have to get it from somewhere. If we're lucky and we grow up in a nice family environment, we get pocket money off our parents. And then when we grow up, we have a job and we get money off our employer, or we might go self-employed. We get money off our customers. And, when we pay money for things, when we're in that position of earning money, we think we're doing what our parents did for us. We're giving money, and we never drill down into it and go, well, where did it come from? Because it's a thing. I can hold it in my hand, or I can, take it to the bank and they can just tally up how much of it I've got. It's a real thing. It moves stuff. It moves resources around in this economy. Try being without it. In fact, it's impossible. You'll starve. But we never go like, where does it come from? So I've given you all these stories, or we've given you these stories about business cards and gold coins, or just coins found in Pompeii. And people kind of go, well, that's nice. That's a nice analogy. But even for maybe a more sophisticated listener who's kind of having trouble with going, well, look, it's all computers now and stuff. Well, I think we all agree, even the Austrian school economists agree, that the central bank sets interest rates. There's a thing called the Monetary Policy Committee, and they decide every, I think, 6 weeks whether they're going to raise or lower interest rates or keep them the same. And in order to be able to do that, they have to add or drain reserve balances from the system, the reserve system. And that it's a little bit complicated, so I won't go any further with that. But, that is how they target interest rates. They decide on a target, and then they do what's called offsetting operating factors all day, open market operations, buying bonds, selling bonds in the secondary market to make sure that they maintain the interest rate they said they were going to hit. And they also have an inflation target, which is 2%. Generally, and if they don't hit their 2% inflation rate target, either they overshoot it or undershoot it by a certain extent, they have to write a kind of "we're really sorry" type letter to the Chancellor. and you can go on the Bank of England's website and see the history of those letters and stuff. And just for everybody's information, they've been undershooting their inflation target ever since quantitative easing, which, 2008, which MMT has a solid explanation for why that is, when everybody else.
And which everybody thought would cause hyperinflation.
Because everybody said cute.
Yeah, if we could just get onto this quite quickly, because we had a couple of episodes earlier on, our main sort of economics episodes so far have been about quantitative easing. And this, again, is another example of where you can get into confusion, and because effectively quantitative easing is, in a sense, the government printing money to buy up bonds.
We don't like that word.
Well, what we would say is that they're not printing money to what, say, somebody like Warren Mosler would say, who I keep talking about, but he is the founder of MMT. He had the original insights by looking closely at central bank operations. Is that the bonds themselves are money? You could say they're printing money if you don't count the bonds as money. And this will sort of like help you, if you let me just spin this out a little bit, this will help you understand the national debt and the difference between the debt and the deficit. I think Professor Stephanie Kelton, who's just written her book, The Deficit Myth, which I think is just a perfect, if you've never come across MMT before and you want to know what it's all about, it's the perfect book to read. She's giving a lecture or giving a talk or something. She'll go, right, okay, so here are my dollars. And she's got 10 pieces of paper and they're yellow. And she goes, I'm going to spend 10 into the economy. I'm the government, you're the private sector. And she nominates a person in the audience to be the private sector. I'm going to spend 10. I'm going to tax back 7. There's 3 left over. I'm running a deficit of 3. Who's got the 3? And the person holds it up. You've got the 3, right? You guys. So my deficit, I'm spending more than I'm getting in. My deficit is your surplus. And that's true in real life. And you can look at it. There's a very sort of widely shared graph chart that goes around the MMT community of these sectoral balances. But when the government deficit goes up, the private sector savings go up, or the non-government sector savings go up by this same amount to the penny, because they're accounting identities. So first of all, that's the deficit. When the government spends more than it takes back in taxes, that money is now in the pockets and the bank accounts of the private sector. And then Stephanie goes, okay, so we do this thing these days that we don't have to do, but we do it anyway. There's a deficit of 3. I'm running a deficit of 3. So I'm the government. I now have to go into the market and sell 3 of these. And she holds up yellow pieces of paper and she goes, these are yellow dollars, right? These are better than the $3 that you've got. These are bonds, government bonds, right? These ones pay interest. So you're going to want to buy these because they're better than money. They're money that pays you money. So I go into the market and I sell 3 of these. Now you've got the yellow dollars. I don't need the green dollars that you just gave me for them. They just go in the shredder. And now you've got those. And then when they mature, I'll be able to pay back, what I said I would pay back plus interest, because, it's a spreadsheet. We're not going to run out of money. We're not going to run out of spreadsheet entries to pay back the interest. So I think that is a really a sort of good way to break through the complications about what bonds are. So you've just swapped green dollars for yellow dollars. Green dollars don't pay interest. Yellow dollars do. So you could call that money printing, but it's not really. It's just swapping swapping non-interest dollars for interest-bearing dollars. And she also then asks her students a question sometimes where she goes, I've got a magic wand in my hand. If you could wave this wand and have the government debt wiped out, would you wave it? And loads of people go, yeah, I'd wave that wand, And then she goes, okay, if I could wave this wand and there would be no more Treasury securities ever again, US Treasury securities, would you wave the wand? And some of them cotton on that it's the same question. And some of them, it takes them a minute. But, basically, the private sector loves this risk-free investment vehicle called the US Treasury security. It's money that pays you money. So, on the one hand, people are the debt's so big, but the debt really is these, wonderful interest-bearing pounds that is just really what MMT is saying is just a free lunch for people who already have money.
But when we see that sort of government debt figure of however many $1 trillion it is, this is, mostly or all in the form of bonds that have been bought by people and are being held as assets. And this is why you don't really see the government debt necessarily, declining over time. I mean, you can go back to stories in the 1980s and the 1970s and so on, when the debts of the US and the UK were smaller, and people were saying, okay, well, eventually we're going to reach a point where this debt is unsustainable and it has to be paid off in some sense. But that's sort of not what has ever happened. We've just carried on expanding this debt. And in a sense, when we expand the debt, what we're really doing is expanding the supply of government bonds rather than the notion that you might have of debt as sort of privately held debt, where your debt is the amount of money that you have to pay back to other people. I
think they make a parallel between private debt and government debt when in fact they're like the complete opposites, right? So government debt is our savings, and Warren Mosler would say government debt is the net money supply. This money supply after you take out all the liabilities. And so this idea that, fear this big number that I've got here because it's big and you're going to have to pay it in taxes in future, it bears really no basis in reality, because the interest is actually paid through newly created money. So there is taxes don't actually go into paying anything, let alone the interest rates.
Because there's this talking point that comes up between sort of that comes up from people who kind of know a bit about economics, where they go, "Oh yeah, the government shouldn't be scared to borrow right now to increase its spending because interest rates are so low." And again, that's not the MMT take. The MMT take is the government can spend whatever it wants because it creates money when it spends. It's not going to run out of it. The interest rate is set by the government. It really doesn't come into it. And also because the government and the private sector aren't competing for a limited pool of savings, which is the sort of loanable funds theory. That, if the government borrows, quote unquote, borrows more, i.e. sells more bonds, does this asset swap where it swaps green dollars for yellow dollars or green pounds for yellow pounds. If it does more of that, then it crowds out the private sector's the private sector also wants some of that money, wants to borrow some of that money for investment, and it's crowding it out, and that's what pushes up interest rates. And it's actually not that, that is that's the old-fashioned model, that's the neoclassical model of what affects interest rates, and it's just not that way at all. And I find it quite bizarre that really clever people still think that that's how it works, when we know that there's this thing called the Monetary Policy Committee who decide what the interest rate's going to be. And, it really doesn't, it's not, it's really not a floating thing that gets affected by government spending.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, And you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.